Snow presses quietly against the turf walls tonight, while the hearth glows low and the longhouse breathes slow around you. If a slow night like this is what you needed, a quiet like helps this find its way to someone else who needs it too. And if you're settling in, leave a comment and tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight. It's nice to know who's out there in the dark with me. Before we begin, dim the lights, get comfortable, and let everything else wait until morning. Long before the first snow fell across the fjords, Norse communities had already begun preparing for a season that could last more than half the year. Historians studying Viking Age Scandinavia note that winter there was not simply a change of weather, but a complete reorganization of daily life, one that shaped how longhouses were built, how food was stored, and how families arranged themselves within a single shared room for months at a time. The longhouse itself was the foundation of winter survival. These structures, often 60 to 80 feet long, were built low to the ground, with thick turf walls layered over a timber frame. The turf, cut in heavy sod blocks, acted as natural insulation, trapping warmth inside while blocking the wind that swept in off the water. Roofs were similarly covered in sod, sometimes thick enough to support grass growth, which meant a longhouse in deep winter might look, from a distance, like little more than a long snow-covered mound rising from the landscape. Inside, the design was deliberately communal. A single central hearth ran down the middle of the main room, and everyone within the household, family members, laborers, sometimes livestock in a partitioned section at one end, shared that one source of heat. This was not a matter of comfort alone. Sharing space and warmth was a practical response to a climate where a poorly insulated or isolated structure could mean real danger. Body heat from animals stabled at one end of the house genuinely contributed to warming the human living quarters at the other. Smoke from the hearth fire had nowhere convenient to go. Longhouses typically had only a small hole in the roof and no chimney in the modern sense, which meant smoke lingered near the ceiling before slowly finding its way out. Archaeologists have found that the underside of roof beams in excavated longhouses is often blackened from centuries, or in some cases just a single hard winter of accumulated soot. People adapted by living and sleeping close to the floor, below the worst of the smoke, on raised platforms built along the walls. Firewood and fuel had to be gathered and rationed with real foresight, since Scandinavian forests, while present, were not limitless, and cutting during the winter itself was far harder than stockpiling in advance. Some households supplemented wood with dried peat or animal dung, which burned more slowly and could stretch a limited fuel supply across the darkest months. Because daylight in the far north could shrink to only a handful of hours, much of daily life simply happened by firelight, which made the hearth not just a source of heat, but the literal center of gravity for the household, a place for cooking, working, and passing the long evenings. Even clothing choices reflected careful adaptation rather than improvisation. Wool, sheared from hardy sheep bred to withstand the climate, was woven into dense, tightly spun fabric that could resist wind far better than looser weaves. Layering was common, and outer garments were frequently lined or trimmed with fur, seal, fox, or bear depending on region and status, chosen specifically for its ability to trap air and hold warmth against the body. None of this was accidental. It reflected generations of accumulated, practical knowledge about how to remain functional through a season that, in the far north of Scandinavia, could bring weeks where the sun barely rose above the horizon at all. Beneath every layer of wool and fur, Viking clothing depended on a fabric most people today would never think to associate with warmth: linen, worn directly against the skin. Archaeologists studying preserved textile fragments from sites in Denmark and Norway have found that this inner layer served a very specific purpose. Linen wicks moisture away from the body far better than wool does, and in a climate where sweat could freeze against the skin during outdoor labor, That property mattered more than most modern people would assume. Wool came next, and Norse wool was not the soft, uniform fiber familiar today. The sheep bred in Scandinavia during the Viking Age produced a coarse double coat, an outer layer of long, water-resistant guard hairs over a softer undercoat. Weavers sometimes kept these two types of fiber separate, spinning the coarse outer wool into the exterior of a garment where it could shed rain and snow, while the finer undercoat was reserved for layers worn closer to the body. It was, in effect, a naturally engineered rain shell centuries before synthetic fabrics existed. Footwear tells its own story about how seriously the Norse took the problem of cold ground. Leather shoes recovered from Viking sites in York and Hedeby were often lined with fur or stuffed with dry grass, moss, or straw, a practice that not only added warmth but also absorbed moisture through the day. That insulating grass would simply be pulled out and replaced at night, dried by the hearth, and packed back in each morning. It was a small, repeated ritual, but one that could mean the difference between numb feet and functioning ones during a day spent outdoors. Mittens and hand coverings followed a similar logic of layering, often knitted from wool using a technique called knoll-binding, a single-needle looping method that predates modern knitting by centuries and produces a denser, more wind-resistant fabric. Some burial finds include mittens lined with fur on the inside, fur side facing the skin, which trapped a layer of warm air far more effectively than a single sheet of hide ever could. Head coverings mattered just as much as anyone would expect, given how much body heat escapes through an uncovered scalp. A wool hoods, sometimes lined with fur along the edge, framing the face, appear repeatedly in textile finds and artistic depictions from the period. Fragments of what appear to be simple face wraps have also turned up. Thin strips of wool, likely tied across the nose and mouth during the harshest winds. An early, improvised answer to frostbite on exposed skin. What stands out across all of this is not any single clever invention, but the sheer thoughtfulness of the whole system. Every visible layer of clothing had at least one invisible reason behind it: a fiber choice, a lining, a construction technique, quietly solving a problem the wearer may not have even consciously noticed. Staying warm in Viking Scandinavia was never left to chance. Beyond clothing and shelter, Norse communities relied on a quieter kind of technology: the careful management of food itself as a defense against winter. Preservation was not a background task in Viking society. It was a matter of survival that shaped the entire rhythm of the year. Fish, especially cod, was dried on wooden racks in the open air until it became stiff as bark, a product known as screed, which could keep for years without spoiling. Meat was salted, smoked over the hearth fire, or packed in whey, a preservation method that also happened to produce a distinctly sour, tangy flavor that lingered in the diet through the darkest months. Dairy played a larger role than many people expect. Skyr, a thick, strained cultured milk product still eaten in Iceland today, was made in large batches during the productive summer months and stored in barrels, sometimes buried or kept in cool cellars dug into the earth. Butter, too, was packed away in wooden containers and occasionally submerged in bogs, where the cool, oxygen-poor conditions acted as a natural refrigerator. Archaeologists have actually recovered centuries-old bog butter, still recognizable as food. Grain was another quiet obsession. Barley and rye were harvested and dried before the first frost, then ground only as needed throughout winter, since flour spoiled faster than whole grain. This grain became the base for a dense, hearty bread as well as porridge, both of which offered the slow-burning energy needed for bodies working hard to stay warm in cold air. Beer and mead brewed earlier in the year were stored in casks, providing not just calories, but also a safer alternative to drinking water that might otherwise have to be melted from snow or ice. Root vegetables and foraged goods filled in the gaps. Turnips, cabbages, and onions could be stored in cool, dark spaces for months, while wild berries, gathered in late summer, were sometimes dried or preserved in honey. Livestock that could not be fed through the winter were often slaughtered in autumn, a practice that provided a final surge of fresh meat before the lean months began, some of which was eaten immediately, and the rest carefully preserved using the very same salting and smoking methods used for fish. What emerges from all of this is a picture of Viking households constantly working months ahead of the cold itself, stockpiling not just fuel, but calories. Calculating exactly how much dried fish or fermented milk a family would need to reach the far side of winter. Nothing was left to chance, because in a Scandinavian winter, a poorly stocked larder could be just as dangerous as a poorly insulated wall. Beyond food and clothing, Norse households relied on a quieter kind of preparation, one measured in daylight itself. In the far north of Scandinavia, winter could bring weeks where the sun barely rose above the horizon, and communities structured their entire rhythm of work around this scarcity of light. Tasks that required fine vision, such as woodworking, weaving, or repairing tools, were pushed into the short hours around midday, while darker hours were reserved for tasks that could be done by feel or by firelight, like carding wool or mending nets. Lamps played a surprisingly important role in extending the useful day. Soapstone or clay lamps burned fish oil or animal fat, often with a simple wick of moss or twisted plant fiber. These lamps were dim by modern standards, casting only a small circle of usable light, but they allowed families to continue working, talking, or telling stories well after the outside world had gone dark. Oil for these lamps had to be rendered and stored ahead of time, just like food, since hunting and fishing became far more difficult once the fjords began to freeze at their edges. Some archaeological finds suggest that certain Norse settlements adjusted their daily schedules seasonally in a fairly deliberate way, clustering communal activities like cooking, storytelling, and small-scale craftwork into the hours when people were already gathered near the hearth for warmth. This overlap between light, heat, and social life meant that the hearth wasn't only a source of physical survival, but also the practical center of a household's entire waking schedule during winter. Windows, in the modern sense, barely existed. Longhouses typically had only small openings, sometimes covered with translucent animal membrane, or a thin wooden shutter, which let in a little daylight while still holding back wind and cold. This meant that even at midday, the interior of a longhouse often remained dim, reinforcing just how central artificial light, lamps, hearth fire, sometimes burning splinters of resin-rich wood, was to getting anything done once autumn turned toward the depths of winter. Travel and outdoor labor were also reshaped by the shortened days. Journeys by boat or on foot were planned tightly around the hours of usable light. Since navigating fjords or forest paths in complete darkness carried real risk, some communities used the brighter, snow-reflected light of clear winter days to their advantage. Since fresh snow could scatter what little sunlight existed and make outdoor work marginally easier than on overcast days, even if the temperature itself was no warmer. Over time, this constant negotiation with darkness shaped not just work patterns, but expectations around rest itself. Long nights encouraged longer, deeper sleep, broken only by tending the fire or checking on livestock. For many Norse households, winter was as much a matter of managing light and time as it was of managing cold. As the days shortened further, Norse households turned to something beyond food and clothing to survive the season: the careful management of shared time and shared warmth. Long winter evenings gave rise to structured indoor gatherings that historians now group under the term vulvaka, or evening wake, when families and farmhands sat together near the hearth once the day's tending was done. During these hours, storytelling carried real practical weight. Sagas, genealogies, and mythic tales were recited aloud, partly for entertainment, but also as a way of preserving family history and legal knowledge in a largely oral society. A skilled storyteller was a valued presence in a winter household, since the same tales, repeated across many nights, helped pass down land claims, ancestry, and the reputations of kin. Riddles and verse games served a similar purpose, sharpening memory and wit during months when little else could be accomplished outdoors. Hands were rarely idle, even while listening. Wool carding, spinning, and weaving continued by firelight, since textile production for the following year could not simply pause for winter. Women in particular carried much of this seasonal workload, producing the wool cloth that would later become clothing, ship sails, and trade goods. Woodworking, tool repair, and the carving of small household items such as spoons or combs also filled these hours, making the evening wake a time of quiet, continuous productivity rather than true rest. Board games offered another common pastime. Nefataf, a strategy game played on a grid with a king piece defended against attacking pieces, appears repeatedly in archaeological finds across Scandinavia, carved into wood or bone, suggesting it was widespread enough to cross social lines. Game pieces recovered from graves indicate that some board games held enough personal significance to be buried alongside their owners. Music also had a place in these gatherings, though evidence for it is thinner than for stories or games. Simple instruments such as bone flutes and lyres have been recovered from Norse sites, hinting that song accompanied the long nights in at least some households, even if the specific tunes themselves have been lost to time. Beyond entertainment, winter evenings served a quieter social function. They reinforced the bonds within a household that had to rely on one another completely for months at a time. Isolated by snow and darkness, families and workers spent these hours not simply passing time, but maintaining the shared discipline, memory, and cooperation that made surviving the rest of the winter possible. As winter settled deeper into the fjords, illness became one of the season's quieter dangers, and Norse households had their own ways of understanding and responding to it. Cramped longhouses, smoky air, and close contact with livestock created conditions where respiratory ailments could spread quickly from one person to the next. Coughs, chest infections, and lingering colds were common complaints during the darkest months, and with limited fresh food and constant cold exposure, the body had less reserve to fight them off. Medicinal knowledge in this period blended practical herbalism with belief in supernatural causes. Sickness was sometimes attributed to elves, spirits, or the ill will of a neighbor, and treatment could involve charms, chanted verses, or protective symbols alongside physical remedies. Archaeological finds and later medical manuscripts suggest that Norse healers, often women known as Laknar, used plants like yarrow, mugwort, and angelica for their soothing or antiseptic properties. Angelica in particular was prized enough to be deliberately cultivated near farmsteads, valued both as food and as medicine. Wounds and burns, common hazards around an open hearth, were treated with animal fat, honey when available, or moss packed against a cut to draw out moisture and reduce infection. Some sagas mention the use of butter or curdled milk products applied to skin ailments, showing how the same dairy stores used for food doubled as household remedies. Dental health suffered considerably in winter, when the diet leaned heavily on hard bread, dried fish, and grain porridge, all of which wore down teeth over years of chewing. Studies of Norse skeletal remains have shown significant tooth wear and abscesses, conditions that likely caused real discomfort through the cold months when little could be done beyond enduring it. Steam bathing offered one of the more effective responses available. Some farmsteads maintained a small bathhouse structure separate from the main longhouse, where stones were heated in a fire and then doused with water to produce steam, not unlike later sauna traditions found across the Nordic and Baltic world. This practice was valued both for cleanliness, difficult to maintain otherwise in winter, and for easing aching joints and muscles after physically demanding outdoor labor. Cold itself brought its own dangers beyond illness. Frostbite on fingers, toes, and exposed skin was a real risk during outdoor winter work, and severe cases could lead to lasting damage or worse. Norse communities seem to have understood the importance of drying out wet clothing and footwear quickly, which lines up with the daily practice of drying and refreshing fur-lined shoes mentioned in earlier accounts of winter dress. For more serious injuries or difficult childbirths, which did not pause simply because the season was harsh, households relied on the most experienced woman present, often the same person managing food stores and healing herbs. Medical care in Viking-age Scandinavia was, in this sense, deeply woven into the rhythm of the household itself, not a separate profession, but one more skill held alongside cooking, weaving, and tending the fire that kept everyone alive through the dark months. Beyond the hearth and the healer's herbs, Norse households also had to reckon with the psychological weight of winter itself, and the ways darkness and isolation pressed on the mind as much as the body. Modern researchers studying Scandinavian folklore have noted how often Old Norse sources describe a kind of restless dread associated with the deep winter months, sometimes called skamdegi, or the short daytime. It was not simply about cold. It was about the sheer psychological strain of living through weeks where the sun barely climbed above the horizon, if it appeared at all in the northernmost settlements. This is part of why Norse communities leaned so heavily on structure and ritual during winter. The fixed rhythms of the Kvoldbaka gatherings, the recitation of sagas, the steady clack of a loom, were not only practical uses of time, they gave shape to days that otherwise blurred together in near darkness. Some historians argue this structured social rhythm functioned as an early, informal safeguard against the isolation and low mood that long polar nights can produce, something modern medicine would later describe in terms of seasonal light deprivation. Belief systems absorbed this seasonal anxiety as well. Midwinter was closely associated with the idea that the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin, and the midwinter festival of Yule, observed roughly around the solstice, was partly about drawing the community together against that unease. Fires were kept burning longer, and it was considered important that no household allow its hearth to go dark during the year's deepest, longest nights. There was also a very physical toll to being confined indoors for so long. Norse skeletal and settlement evidence suggests that reduced movement during peak winter, combined with smoky air and close quarters, likely affected joint stiffness and general vitality, particularly among older members of a household. Some families used physical labor, woodworking, tool repair, leatherworking, as a deliberate outlet, giving people something to do with their hands and bodies, even when outdoor work was impossible. Interestingly, dream interpretation held a notable place in Norse winter culture. Sagas frequently include lengthy dream sequences treated as meaningful omens, often recounted the next morning as part of the evening's conversation. Some scholars suggest that the sheer amount of sleep and darkness during winter months made dreams unusually vivid and memorable, feeding directly into a broader Norse tradition of prophetic and symbolic dreaming that shows up again and again in the literature. Taken together, these winter coping strategies, social, spiritual, and physical, reveal a culture that understood, even without modern language for it, that surviving winter meant tending to the mind as carefully as the body. Warmth mattered, food mattered, but so did companionship, rhythm, and meaning during the darkest stretch of the year. Beyond the hearth and the healer's herbs, Norse communities relied on something less visible but equally vital, an intricate understanding of the animals around them, built up over generations spent watching the natural world through long winters. Farmers timed slaughter, fishing, and even travel by close observation of animal behavior, treating certain signs as reliable indicators of coming weather. Livestock growing unusually thick coats early in autumn was read as a warning of a harsh season ahead, prompting earlier stockpiling of fuel and feed than usual. Birds played a particular role in this seasonal reading. The behavior of ravens, already tied to Odin in myth, was watched closely. Their flight patterns and calls were thought to hint at storms, shifts in temperature, or the safety of a coming journey. Fishermen along the fjords paid attention to how seabirds gathered near the water's edge, since sudden flocking inland sometimes preceded rough weather that made boat travel dangerous. None of this was considered separate from practical survival. It was survival. Sea ice presented its own quiet language. Coastal households learned to distinguish between different textures and colors of ice, understanding which surfaces might hold a person's weight and which concealed thin, dangerously unstable patches beneath a deceptive crust of snow. This knowledge was passed down verbally, refined through the hard lessons of accidents, since a single misjudged crossing could mean drowning in freezing water far from any hearth. Domesticated animals also carried real economic weight through the season, and their care shaped daily winter labor. Horses, sturdy and cold-adapted, were still brought into shelter during the worst storms, since even a hardy Icelandic-type horse could suffer badly from prolonged exposure combined with poor grazing. Sheep left in more sheltered pastures were checked periodically, with herders sometimes digging through snow to reach grass beneath, a practice that demanded both stamina and an intimate knowledge of local terrain built up over years of walking the same hillsides. Dogs, too, held a working role beyond companionship. They helped manage herds, guarded homesteads from predators drawn closer by winter scarcity, and in some regions may have assisted in tracking game when fresh meat supplies ran low. Their presence inside, or near the longhouse, likely added, in a small way, to the shared warmth already generated by penned livestock at one end of the hall. What emerges from these fragments, preserved in sagas, in bone remains, in the layout of farm buildings, is a picture of winter survival that depended not just on stored food or thick walls, but on a continuously updated, communal memory of the land and its creatures. Every household's ability to endure the cold rested partly on skills that had nothing to do with fire or wool at all, and everything to do with reading a world that offered its warnings quietly. To those willing to notice them, it was a form of knowledge as essential, in its own way, as any physical shelter they built. Beyond reading the land and the animals, Norse communities also relied on their own bodies of accumulated knowledge about the calendar itself, tracking the turning of the year through the sky, rather than any written schedule. Norse farmers and sailors marked the passage of winter using solar observation points, noting where the sun rose and set against fixed landmarks on the horizon, such as a particular notch in a distant mountain ridge or the edge of a known rock formation. As the sun's position shifted day by day, a household could judge roughly how far into the dark season they had traveled and how much longer remained before the light began to return. This kind of horizon-based reckoning mattered enormously in a region where the sun might barely clear the horizon for weeks, and where formal calendars were of little practical use to people whose lives were governed by weather rather than dates. Some scholars believe certain longhouse doorways and hearth orientations were positioned with these solar angles in mind, allowing a narrow beam of midwinter light to fall across a specific spot on the floor as a kind of seasonal marker, a quiet, architectural way of counting the dark. Alongside the sun, the Norse paid close attention to the moon, since its light became disproportionately valuable once daylight hours shrank to almost nothing. Journeys, hunting trips, and even social gatherings were sometimes timed around a full moon, when snow-covered ground could reflect enough brightness to make travel after dusk far safer than it would otherwise have been. A bright, still, moonlit night over snow could offer more usable light than an overcast midday in the deep of winter. Weather lore also extended to the wind itself, with particular directions and qualities of wind associated with coming storms, or, conversely, with a stretch of calm worth taking advantage of. A sudden shift from a biting northerly wind to a milder westerly breeze might be read as an opening to travel or fish, a narrow window before conditions worsened again. Elders within a household were often the keepers of this kind of layered, half-practical and half-traditional knowledge. Having spent decades comparing one winter against another and passing down small rules of thumb, this kind of frost usually means a thaw within the week. That kind of sky usually means it will hold. Halos around the sun or moon, caused by ice crystals high in the atmosphere, were noted with particular interest, sometimes interpreted as a sign of changing weather within a day or two. Whether or not the underlying reasoning matched what is now understood about atmospheric physics, the practice reflected the same underlying habit found throughout Norse winter survival. Careful, repeated observation, tested across generations until certain patterns simply proved reliable enough to trust. When the difference between a safe journey and a dangerous one might come down to reading the sky correctly. Beyond reading the sky, Norse communities also depended on the sea itself to survive the winter months, and coastal households developed a deep working knowledge of tides, currents, and the behavior of ice along the fjords. Fishermen learned to recognize which stretches of water stayed open even in the coldest months, kept fluid by underwater currents or the movement of tidal channels, and these open water pockets became lifelines when stored food ran low. Knowing exactly where those channels lay could mean the difference between a successful midwinter catch and a wasted, dangerous trip onto unreliable ice. Boats themselves needed careful winter management. Vessels left in the water risked being crushed or locked in place as ice formed around their hulls. So many were hauled ashore before the hardest freezes, stored under simple shelters, and sometimes packed with straw or turf to prevent the wood from cracking in the cold. Tar and animal fat were reapplied to hulls in early winter as a protective barrier, since a boat's seaworthiness the following spring depended entirely on how well it had been maintained through the frozen months. A cracked or waterlogged hull, discovered too late, could delay fishing or trade voyages that a household could not afford to lose. When travel across frozen fjords or lakes was unavoidable, Norse communities used a mix of tools and techniques to move safely and efficiently. Ice skates carved from animal bone, usually the shin bones of horses or cattle, were strapped to the feet and used with a single pole for balance and propulsion, letting travelers cover long distances quickly on solid ice. Sledges pulled by hand or by horse carried firewood, hay, and trade goods across terrain that would have been slow or impassable on foot during the snowiest stretches of the year. Skis, meanwhile, were far more than recreational. Archaeological finds and later medieval sources suggest they were essential winter equipment across much of Scandinavia. Early skis varied in length and shape by region, some broad and short for control in dense forest, others long and narrow for speed across open, wind-packed snow. Skill on skis carried enough cultural weight that it appears in Norse mythology itself, with the god Ullr closely associated with skiing, hunting, and the winter season more broadly, a reflection of how central this mode of travel was to daily survival, rather than simply a poetic detail invented for the sagas. Judging the safety of a frozen crossing required more than watching the ice's surface color, a skill covered before. Communities also paid attention to subtle sounds, the way ice cracked or groaned underfoot, and to how snow cover sat unevenly across a frozen lake. Since drifted snow could mask thinner patches beneath, elders often passed this layered knowledge down directly, walking younger family members across familiar routes and pointing out the small signs that written records rarely thought to preserve. Beyond the practical work of travel and repair, winter placed real strain on Norse livestock in ways that required constant, careful management. Cattle, sheep, and goats could not simply be left to fend for themselves through months of snow and darkness. So farmers built dedicated byres, low turf-covered structures attached to or near the longhouse, where animals spent the coldest stretches of the season under close supervision. Keeping animals alive through winter was as much about arithmetic as instinct. A household had to judge, back in autumn, how many animals its stored hay and fodder could actually sustain until spring. Guess wrong. And a family risked either starving its herd or exhausting its own food reserves, trying to keep too many animals fed. This calculation shaped the earlier decision to slaughter a portion of the herd before winter began. It wasn't only about fresh meat, but about narrowing the number of mouths a farm had to answer for until the thaw. Hay itself was a precious and carefully rationed resource, Fields were cut and dried in the brief height of summer, then stored in barns or stacked in dry-built mounds, sometimes weighted down against wind. A poor summer haymaking season could quietly doom animals months later, long after the grass had already been cut and forgotten. Norse farmers spoke of hay almost the way they spoke of grain, as something that had to last exactly as long as the dark did, with no margin for miscalculation. Water posed its own quiet challenge. Streams and troughs froze solid for weeks at a time, meaning someone had to break ice by hand, sometimes multiple times a day, simply so animals could drink. In smaller or more isolated farms, this task fell to children or elders, those not needed for heavier outdoor labor, giving winter its own internal division of chores, built around the season's specific demands, rather than the usual rhythms of farm life. Pregnant or nursing animals received particular attention, since losing a mother or newborn in the depths of winter could ripple forward into the following year's milk, wool, and meat supply. Some households even brought especially vulnerable animals, like a weak lamb, briefly indoors near the hearth, blurring the line between human and animal shelter that already existed at the far end of many longhouses. It was a practical kindness, but also a calculated one. Every animal that survived the winter represented food, clothing material, or labor that the farm would otherwise have to find some other way to replace. Beyond the animals themselves, winter placed its own quiet demands on the tools and structures that kept a farm running at all. Wooden implements like plows, rakes, and cartwheels were brought under cover during the cold months, since damp wood left exposed to freezing and thawing cycles could crack or warp beyond repair by spring. A farmer who neglected this might find, come the first thaw, that half his equipment needed replacing before planting could even begin. Rope and cordage, often made from plant fiber or twisted hide, received similar attention. Left outside, it grew brittle in the cold, or rotted under repeated wetting and freezing, so households coiled it carefully and stored it in drier corners of outbuildings. Leather harnesses and tack were rubbed with fat to keep them supple, since stiff, cracked leather could snap under strain at the worst possible moment out on the ice, or hauling a sledge through deep snow. Iron tools posed a different problem. Without regular care, blades and fittings rusted in the damp air, trapped inside turf-walled outbuildings, so they were often wiped with oil or animal fat before being set aside for the season. A dull, corroded axe head was not a small inconvenience. It could mean the difference between gathering enough firewood before a storm and running dangerously short partway through it. Fencing and pen structures needed checking too, since heavy snow load or shifting ground from freeze-thaw cycles could weaken posts and rails. A collapsed pen in the middle of winter risked losing livestock to exposure or wandering off into terrain where they might not survive the night. Farmers often reinforced weak points in autumn, anticipating exactly this kind of failure before the snow made repairs far harder to carry out. Grain storage containers, whether wooden bins or woven baskets, were inspected for gaps that might let in moisture or small animals seeking warmth and food. A single breach could spoil weeks' worth of stored grain, a loss a household could ill afford halfway through a long winter, with no way to replenish supplies until spring travel became possible again. Even the simplest household objects, then, carried a kind of seasonal responsibility. Wood, iron, leather, and rope each had their own quiet vulnerabilities to cold and damp, and tending to them was as much a part of winter survival as feeding livestock or keeping the hearth alight through the long, dark months. Beyond the farmstead itself, winter placed particular demands on how Norse households managed water, waste, and the everyday hazards of a landscape locked in ice. Fresh water in winter could not simply be drawn from a stream the way it was in warmer months, since many smaller waterways froze solid for weeks at a time. Households often relied on knowledge passed down about which springs stayed active through the cold, fed by underground warmth that kept them from icing over completely. Where no such spring existed nearby, Someone had to travel daily to break ice on a larger river or fjord edge, a task that fell disproportionately on children or lower status members of the household. Waste disposal also shifted with the season. In summer, household refuse and animal dung could be spread relatively easily across fields or middens, but frozen ground made digging nearly impossible. Families often stockpiled waste near the longhouse through the coldest months, only clearing and spreading it once the thaw softened the earth enough to work. This seasonal buildup, unpleasant as it sounds today, was simply an accepted rhythm of northern life, one more task pushed to spring alongside so many others. Ice itself posed constant, quiet danger around the homestead. Roof edges built up heavy icicles that could break loose without warning, and packed snow on turf roofs sometimes grew heavy enough to strain the structure beneath it. It was not unusual for someone to be tasked, after a heavy snowfall, with clearing roof buildup using a long wooden pole, working carefully from the ground rather than climbing up onto ice-slick turf. Paths between the longhouse, byre, and storage buildings were also treated with care, sometimes covered with ash, sand, or crushed bark to cut down on slipping, since a broken bone in midwinter carried far graver consequences than in any other season. Water management extended to drainage as well. Turf walls and roofs, so effective at holding in warmth, could become saturated if meltwater or rain was allowed to pool against them, risking rot in the structure and cold, damp interiors. Households dug shallow channels around the base of buildings to divert runoff away from walls, a small piece of engineering easy to overlook but essential to keeping a longhouse dry and warm through months of freeze and thaw. Even food storage containers needed defense against moisture drawn in by shifting winter temperatures. Condensation forming inside sealed vessels as warm indoor air met cold outer walls. Some households layered dried moss or straw around stored barrels and crocks, both for insulation and to draw away dampness that might otherwise spoil grain or dried fish before spring finally returned. Beyond the farmstead itself, winter placed particular demands on the tools of iron and wood that a Norse household could not simply replace once the snow closed in. Blacksmiths timed much of their heaviest work for the months before winter began, knowing that once deep cold set in, the forge became harder to keep at working temperature, and travel to trade for fuel or raw iron grew far riskier. Charcoal, essential for smithing, was produced and stored in careful quantities beforehand, since making fresh charcoal in the depths of winter meant tending a slow-burning earthen kiln out in weather that could kill a man who lingered too long beside it. Repairs to metal fittings, hinges, blades, and cooking implements were often pushed through in a hurried stretch of early autumn labor. A cracked cooking pot or a dulled axe head discovered in January could not easily wait for a smith's attention, so households tried to anticipate their own wear and tear, mending or replacing what they could before the first hard frost. Knives and axes used constantly through the dark months for splitting firewood, butchering stored meat, or cutting through ice were sharpened often, since a poor edge in cold conditions meant more force, more slipping, and more injury. Woodworking followed a similar seasonal logic. Bowls, spoons, troughs, and the wooden frames of tools were often carved during the very evenings the previous chapter touched on, when firelight gatherings gave people idle hours indoors. But larger construction work, repairing a damaged roof beam, or reinforcing a weakened wall post, was far riskier once frozen wood became brittle and prone to splitting under the axe. Norse craftsmen understood that timber cut and worked while still slightly green behaved differently than wood stiffened by hard frost. So major structural work was, whenever possible, finished before true winter arrived. Textile tools also needed seasonal attention. Spindles, loom weights, and the wooden beams of upright looms used for weaving through the winter evenings required occasional adjustment and repair to keep the tension and balance correct, since a warped or cracked loom part could halt weeks of cloth production at a time when replacing wool goods was simply not possible. Needles, whether of bone, antler, or iron, were kept carefully stored and accounted for. Small objects easily lost in straw or ash, but essential for mending clothing that had to last through months of hard wear. Even fishing equipment received this kind of preventive care. Nets made from plant fiber or wool cordage were inspected for weak spots and reknotted where needed, since a net that failed while checking an ice fishing hole could mean losing both the catch and, in the worst cases, the fisherman himself. Hooks and small iron fittings were checked for rust and sharpness. Another quiet task folded into the long rhythm of preparation that shaped nearly every corner of Norse winter life long before the first heavy snow ever fell. Beyond wood and metal, Norse households also had to prepare their trade and communication lines before the fjords closed in for the season. Once ice sealed the harbors and mountain passes drifted shut, a farm's ability to reach neighbors, markets, or a chieftain's hall could vanish for months at a time. Autumn was therefore the season for settling debts, finalizing trades, and exchanging news. Since disputes left unresolved before the freeze might have no practical remedy until spring, Norse law speakers and local assemblies, known as things, often scheduled their final sessions before winter closed travel routes, since a case delayed could mean months of uncertainty over land, inheritance, or livestock ownership. Messages meant to reach distant kin or trading partners were sent in the last usable weeks of autumn. Since a letter or verbal message entrusted to a traveler had little chance of moving once snow buried the paths, coastal and inland communities also relied on informal signal systems to share urgent news across distances too great for casual travel. Smoke by day or fire by night, lit from prominent hills or headlands, could warn of danger, mark a death, or call scattered households together for a shared threat, like raiders or wolves grown bold in a hard season. These were not universal or official codes so much as understood local customs, passed down within a district and adjusted as needed. But they meant a farm did not have to be entirely isolated, even when physically cut off by snow. Traveling merchants and itinerant craftsmen, such as comb makers or traders in soapstone vessels, timed their final rounds carefully, since being caught between settlements when a storm rolled in could be as dangerous as any illness. Hospitality customs obligated households to shelter such travelers regardless of prior acquaintance, both as a matter of honor and as simple survival logic. A refused traveler in deep winter might not survive to tell of the refusal, and reputation in a small community mattered enormously to future trade and marriage prospects. Even within a single valley, households often arranged in advance which families would check on isolated elders or smaller farms if snow made travel unusually difficult. An informal safety network built well before the first real storm. Marriages, fosterings, and alliances between farms meant that this obligation was rarely purely charitable. It reinforced kinship ties that mattered for defense, inheritance, and labor sharing throughout the rest of the year. In this way, the practical work of closing off a farm for winter was never only about tools and animals. It was also about making sure the human connections a household depended on could survive the season's isolation just as carefully as its grain stores or its livestock. As autumn deepened into the season of near-total isolation, Norse households also had to settle something less practical, but no less important: how conflicts and grievances would be handled once the thing assemblies could no longer meet and travel between farms became dangerous or impossible. Icelandic law codes, later written down in texts like Gragas, show that certain categories of disputes were expected to wait until spring, with informal truces holding communities together through the dark months. A killing or a serious insult might demand action under ordinary circumstances, but winter itself became a kind of forced pause, a season when the practical impossibility of gathering witnesses or traveling to assembly site was built into how people understood justice. This didn't mean grudges simply vanished. Sagas describe long winters spent nursing resentment, tension building quietly inside a household or between neighboring farms until it finally broke open with the first passable roads of spring. Some scholars studying these narratives have noted a pattern: conflicts introduced in autumn chapters, simmering silently through the winter portion of the story, then erupting into violence or legal action almost exactly when the snow began to melt. Whether this reflects real seasonal rhythms of Norse life or simply narrative convenience is debated, but the pattern appears often enough to suggest it drew on lived experience. Oaths and formal promises carried particular weight heading into winter. Since there was no way to quickly verify or challenge someone's word once travel stopped, a person who pledged support, loyalty, or repayment before the snow came was, in effect, making a promise that could not be tested for months. Breaking such an oath after winter isolation ended could carry lasting social damage, since the community had no choice but to trust it unverified for an entire season. Households also used the early winter weeks to formalize arrangements for foster children, a common Norse practice where children were raised in another family's home to strengthen alliances between farms. Fostering agreements, like debts and legal claims, needed to be settled before roads closed, since a child sent to a foster family in autumn would likely remain there without visits home until spring. Even marriage negotiations followed this seasonal logic. Families preferred to finalize betrothals before winter isolation set in, since the long months ahead offered time for a bride's household to prepare textiles, food stores, and goods for a wedding that would typically take place after the thaw. In this way, the practical rhythms of winter survival quietly shaped even the most personal decisions of Norse family life, binding legal, social, and emotional timelines to the same unforgiving calendar as firewood and dried fish. Beyond oaths and family arrangements, Norse communities also used the winter shutdown to settle matters of trade credit and ownership that could otherwise fester for months without resolution. Debts owed in goods rather than coin, such as bolts of wadmal cloth or measures of dried fish, were often recorded through witnessed verbal agreement rather than any written ledger, since literacy was uneven and paper scarce. This meant memory itself became a kind of legal record, and the people present at a bargain's making carried real responsibility for recalling its terms accurately months later, sometimes long after the goods had already changed hands. Inheritance questions followed a similar seasonal logic. When a household head died in autumn, heirs frequently could not travel to distant kin to settle claims on land or livestock until spring. So provisional arrangements were made to keep a farm functioning through the dark months without triggering disputes that couldn't yet be resolved in front of witnesses or an assembly. A widow or eldest son might manage property temporarily under an understanding that final division would wait, an arrangement resting entirely on trust within a small community where reputation mattered more than any document. Land boundary disputes, too, were commonly deferred. Boundary markers, whether stones, ditches, or marked trees, were far easier to inspect and argue over in daylight and thawed ground than in the darkness and snow cover of winter, when a contested marker might simply be invisible. Neighbors with overlapping claims to a hay meadow or a stretch of shoreline often agreed, sometimes uneasily, to leave the matter untouched until conditions allowed a proper walk of the land together. Even matters of hired labor followed this rhythm. Seasonal workers, such as those brought in for the autumn slaughter or the final hay cutting, were typically paid out and their contracts closed before winter isolation set in. Since a household could not easily resolve a wage dispute with someone who might be snowed into a farm 3 valleys away until spring, loose ends of this kind were, wherever possible, tied off deliberately before the roads disappeared. What emerges across all of this is a society that treated winter not simply as a hardship to endure, but as a known constraint shaping how agreements, property, and obligation were structured well in advance. The coming cold didn't just test what people had already prepared. It quietly organized the rhythm of their entire year. Beyond debts and disputes, winter also became a season for settling matters of the mind, a stretch when Norse communities turned inward, taking stock of relationships and obligations that had nothing to do with property at all. Marriages already agreed upon were often reaffirmed through small gestures of goodwill before the roads closed. Gifts of cloth or crafted tools exchanged between families to reinforce a bond that would not be tested again until spring travel resumed. Disputes among neighbors that fell short of formal legal weight, the kind of friction over a borrowed tool, never returned, or a careless word spoken at a gathering, were frequently addressed through mediation by a respected local figure before winter set in. It was understood that grudges left to fester through months of enforced closeness, in a landscape where escape from one's neighbors was nearly impossible, could sour an entire household's winter. A community elder or gud might informally broker peace, not through legal ruling, but through simple social pressure and shared meals meant to smooth things over. Correspondence of a more personal nature also had its autumn deadline. Runic messages carved onto wood, known as rune sticks, carried everything from trade notes to short personal greetings, and many surviving examples suggest that people used the last window before winter to send word to family living at a distance, reassurances, invitations, or simple confirmations that all was well. Once snow closed the paths, months might pass without any way to know whether a message had even arrived. Oaths of fostering loyalty and mutual aid between allied households were sometimes renewed each autumn as well. A ritual reaffirmation, rather than a new agreement, meant to remind both sides of obligations that winter isolation would make impossible to enforce or renegotiate. There was a practical wisdom in this. A promise, spoken aloud in front of witnesses in October, had to survive, untested and unspoken, through 5 or 6 months of silence. Renewing it before the first snow was a way of making sure it would hold. Even grief followed this rhythm. Norse sources suggest that formal mourning periods and the social visits that accompanied them were often compressed or rushed to completion before winter, since a death occurring too close to the first heavy snowfall might mean surviving family could not be properly visited or comforted until spring. The household left alone with its loss through the darkest months was a fate people worked hard to avoid arranging for one another, checking in where they could, sending word where distance allowed, before the season made even that small kindness impossible. By the time the last snow closed the fjord paths, Norse communities had already turned their attention towards something less tangible than food stores or repaired tools, the question of who would look after whom until spring. Many farms entered informal winter pacts with their neighbors, quiet agreements to share surplus grain or dried fish if one household's stores ran short before the thaw. These arrangements were rarely written down. They rested instead on reputation, on the understanding that a family known for stinginess in autumn might find no one willing to help them in February. Such pacts mattered because winter scarcity was never evenly distributed. A household that lost a milking cow to illness, or whose hay had gone moldy from a wet summer, could find itself dangerously short by midwinter, even while a neighboring farm had plenty. Sagas and later folk tradition both suggest that quietly sending a portion of meat or butter to a struggling household was considered a mark of good character, something remembered and repaid, sometimes years later, in entirely different circumstances. There was also a darker calculation beneath this generosity. A destitute household in deep winter was not just a private misfortune, it was a potential danger to the wider settlement. Desperate people might resort to theft, or simply die in ways that unsettled the whole community's sense of order. Helping a struggling neighbor was in part a way of protecting the stability of the group as a whole. Self-interest and kindness were not easily separated in this world. Some regions developed more formal versions of this instinct. Certain law codes describe obligations placed on wealthier landholders to support tenants or dependents through hard winters, effectively an early form of structured welfare tied to land tenure rather than personal charity alone. This wasn't universal, and enforcement likely varied a great deal between regions and periods, but it points to a broader recognition that surviving a Scandinavian winter was rarely a purely individual achievement. Livestock, too, could become part of these winter safety nets. A farm with surplus animals sometimes loaned breeding stock to a neighbor who had lost theirs, an arrangement that could take years to repay an offspring, but that kept smaller farms from collapsing entirely after a bad season. These loans were remembered carefully, since livestock represented wealth that could not simply be replaced once winter had already begun. What emerges from all this is a picture of winter not just as a physical trial, but as a social one, a season that tested and often strengthened the quiet webs of obligation, binding one farm to the next. Survival, in the end, rarely depended on any single household standing entirely alone. Beyond the informal food sharing that bound Norse farms together, winter isolation also produced its own quiet economy of favors, involving skilled labor rather than goods. A household that lacked anyone capable of repairing a broken loom or resetting a dislocated joint might send word to a neighboring farm known for such skill, and the debt created by that visit was expected to be repaid later, not necessarily in kind, but whenever circumstance allowed it. This kind of arrangement rarely appeared in writing. It lived instead in memory and reputation, tracked by the people involved and by the wider community who witnessed it. Certain individuals held a recognized, almost specialized status within this winter network: a woman skilled in setting bones, or a man known for calm judgment in resolving disputes, might be called across difficult snow simply because no one else nearby had the same ability. Sagas occasionally mention such figures being fetched during storms, suggesting that their presence was considered worth real risk. Their value increased precisely because travel was so limited. Expertise that might seem minor in summer when many hands were available became far scarcer and more precious once snow closed the usual paths between farms. Winter gatherings for shared tasks also served this quiet function of mutual support. Wool that needed processing in bulk, or a slaughtered animal too large for one household to use before spoilage, sometimes drew several families together for a single afternoon of shared work. These occasions were practical, but they also renewed social ties at a time when isolation could otherwise stretch on for weeks. A farm that had helped with someone else's wool in early winter had, in effect, secured a small measure of goodwill it might need later if illness or bad luck struck its own household before spring. Even acts framed as ordinary generosity carried this undertone of long-term balance. A gift of preserved food to a struggling neighbor was rarely purely charitable in the way it might be understood today. It was, more precisely, an investment in a relationship that both households expected to matter again, sooner or later, once the ice finally broke and travel resumed. Beyond food and skilled labor, Norse communities also leaned on shared physical infrastructure to make winter survivable. Since not every farm could afford its own version of certain costly resources, a communal iron cooking cauldron, large enough to serve several households, was sometimes kept at one central farm and borrowed in turn. Since casting or forging one from scratch demanded skill and fuel many families lacked, returning it promptly and in good repair was itself a quiet form of social accounting, no different in spirit from returning a borrowed axe or a length of rope. Similarly, certain farms held the only functioning quernstone or the only sturdy sledge in a stretch of valley, and neighbors arranged rotating access well before the snow made travel difficult. These arrangements were rarely written down. They lived instead in memory, in the kind of quiet social ledger every household kept about who had borrowed what, and from whom, and when it had last been returned. Boat access followed a similar logic in coastal regions. A single seaworthy rowing boat, kept in usable condition through the cold months, might belong to one farm but serve several, since it represented the only realistic way to reach a neighboring inlet, retrieve stranded livestock, or fetch a healer in an emergency. Its owner held a kind of quiet authority within the community, not through wealth alone, but through the simple fact that others depended on the boat remaining seaworthy. Fire itself could travel between households in a more literal sense. If a hearth went out unexpectedly, through a poorly tended fire, A sudden draft, or simple exhaustion, a neighboring farm might supply glowing embers carried carefully in a covered container, sparing the household the far harder task of striking a new fire from cold, damp materials in the depths of winter. It was a small act, almost unremarkable in the moment, yet it captures something essential about how these winter communities functioned. No single hearth, no single boat, no single tool truly stood alone. Warmth, in every sense, moved from house to house, long before spring made travel easy again. As winter wore on toward its final weeks, something quieter than survival began to matter to Norse households. The slow work of remembering who they had been before the snow came. Genealogies recited during those long Kvoldvaka evenings were not only entertainment, they were a kind of anchor, tying a household to ancestors, to land claims, to obligations owed to them. All of it kept alive purely through voice and repetition, when nothing could be written down and checked. Elderly members of the household often held a particular kind of authority during winter that faded once travel resumed in spring. Their memory of past agreements, past boundary lines, past insults and reconciliations made them living archives in a season when no one could ride out to confirm a disputed fact. A grandmother or an aging farmhand who remembered exactly which family had loaned which quernstone 3 winters ago, carried real social weight simply by holding information no one else could easily verify until the thaw. There was also a quieter emotional undercurrent to these final winter weeks. Norse sources suggest that as the darkest stretch of Skamdegi eased and daylight began, however slowly, to lengthen again, households sometimes marked that shift with small, almost private gestures, a slightly longer evening by the fire, a bit more food set out than strict rationing allowed, a sense that the worst had likely passed even if snow still lay deep outside. It was not a formal festival. It was closer to a collective exhale. Children raised through these final winter weeks absorbed something that no saga directly states, but that archaeologists and historians infer from how consistently Norse winter practices were passed down, almost unchanged for generations. Patience learned early, alongside a working knowledge of ice, wind, and hunger, mattered as much as any tool. A child who had sat through enough Kvoldvaka evenings, watched enough elders read the sky, and helped break enough ice from a trough, understood winter not as an enemy to defeat, but as a season to be met on its own terms, year after year. By the time the fjord ice began to loosen, and the first boats were checked for the coming season, the households that had made it through had done so less through any single clever trick of insulation or diet, and more through this whole quiet architecture of habit, memory, and mutual obligation, built patiently across generations who never expected the cold to be conquered, only endured. Together, one more time. As the season drew toward its final turn, Norse households often paused to consider not just how they had endured the winter, but what the winter had asked of them. Survival was rarely framed as a single skill. It was a slow accumulation of small, careful decisions made across many months, most of them unremarkable on their own. Some scholars studying Norse farm settlements have noted that the very design of a homestead, its buildings, its paths, its distance from neighbors, reflected an unspoken understanding that winter would eventually test every part of it. A well-placed byrie, a well-worn path, a well-maintained tool. These were not just practical choices, they were quiet forms of foresight, built by people who could not always predict the severity of a given winter, only prepare for the possibility of a hard one. There is also something notable in how little Norse winter survival depended on any single dramatic act. No single fire, no single stored barrel of grain, no single skilled healer saved a household on their own. It was the layering of many ordinary efforts, insulation and food storage, social bonds and shared tools, oral memory and careful timing, that made the difference between a difficult season and a fatal one. Historians who reconstruct these winters often describe them less as battles against the cold and more as long exercises in patience and coordination. That coordination extended beyond the household itself. A community's ability to survive winter was often tied directly to how well its members trusted one another. Since so many resources, a boat, a cauldron, a sledge, a piece of specialized knowledge, could not be owned or mastered by every family alone. In this sense, winter did not simply test physical endurance, it tested the strength of relationships that had been built long before the first snow fell. Modern life has largely removed the immediate, visible threat that Norse winters once posed. Few people today track ice thickness by sound, or judge an approaching storm by the shift of. There is one more thread worth following before the season finally loosens its grip, and it has less to do with survival itself than with how people made sense of surviving. Norse communities did not simply endure winter and move on. They carried it with them, folding the experience into the stories they told about themselves. Sagas, composed generations after the events they describe, often linger, briefly but deliberately, on the hardship of a particular winter. A lean season, a heavy snow, a household stretched thin. These details rarely change the plot. They are not there to build tension. They seem included simply because winter had become part of how a family understood its own history, a kind of measuring stick for hardship endured and relationships tested. That habit of remembering shaped identity in quieter ways too. A household that had weathered an especially brutal winter without losing livestock, without a death, without a serious breach of hospitality, carried a kind of quiet standing afterward. It wasn't boasted about loudly. It surfaced instead in the way neighbors spoke of that family's judgment, or in the willingness of others to lend them tools or trust them with shared resources the following year. Winter, in this sense, functioned almost like a slow, recurring test of a household's competence and character, one whose results accumulated over a lifetime, rather than being settled in a single dramatic moment. There's something worth sitting with in that. Modern life rarely asks anyone to prove themselves against an entire season. Difficulty today tends to arrive in isolated events, a single hard day, a single crisis, rather than as a months-long condition to be steadily managed. For the Norse, winter offered no such isolation. It simply was the background against which ordinary life had to keep functioning, day after dim day, for nearly half the year. And perhaps that is part of why their winter customs feel, even now, oddly familiar. The impulse to gather indoors when the world turns cold and dark. The comfort of a repeated story told by firelight. The quiet reassurance of knowing someone nearby would help if things went wrong. None of this required grand gestures. It required only consistency, repeated season after season, until it became simply how people lived. Nothing about Norse winter survival was effortless, and nothing about it was left to chance, but very little of it depended on heroism either. It depended on ordinary people doing ordinary things, carefully, again and again, until an entire season had quietly passed, and spring, when it finally came, was met not with astonishment, but with the calm satisfaction of a task well managed. As winter finally loosened its hold on the Norse world, there was rarely a single moment of celebration. The change came slowly, almost shyly, in ways that only people who had spent months reading the sky and the snow would notice at all. The first real sign was often not warmth itself, but sound. Meltwater beginning to move beneath old snow made a faint trickling that travelers and farmers alike learned to listen for, since it meant hidden ice on paths and streams could no longer be trusted the way it had been in the deep cold. Sea ice that had been solid enough to walk on for weeks began to soften unevenly, and coastal households treated this transition as one of the most dangerous stretches of the entire year, more so in some ways than the harshest days of midwinter, because complacency after so many safe crossings could be fatal. Animals, once again, were among the clearest messengers. Livestock that had huddled tightly through the darkest months grew restless, drawn toward the edges of pens, as if sensing pasture long before green growth was actually visible. birds returned in a rough, informally understood order, and their arrival was quietly noted by households as a kind of seasonal ledger, one more piece of evidence layered onto everything else that had been tracked since autumn. The thaw did not simply end hardship. In some ways it revealed it. Stores that had been carefully rationed were now visibly thin, and households could finally see, in daylight rather than firelight, exactly how close their calculations had come to running out. Thin livestock, worn tools, and exhausted elders were often most visible in this in-between season, when the danger of winter had passed but recovery had not yet begun. And yet, for all its difficulty, this season of thaw carried something else too, a kind of collective exhale. Neighbors who had spent months separated by snow and ice slowly began to reappear at each other's doors, not for any formal occasion, but simply to confirm that everyone had come through. A shared meal, an exchange of news, a brief accounting of losses and survivals, small gestures that, taken together, marked the closing of one more shared winter. In the end, spring did not erase what had come before it. It simply confirmed that, once again, patience, preparation, and each other had been enough. By the time the first plowable ground appeared, something quieter than relief tended to settle over Norse farmsteads. It was less an event than a mood, a slow exhale spread across many weeks rather than a single morning. Historians who study these communities often note that the transition out of winter left little trace in the archaeological record precisely because it was undramatic. There was no ceremony marking the end of the hard season, no formal declaration that the danger had passed. The proof came instead in small cumulative signs that people simply stopped needing to worry about. One of the gentler markers of this shift was the gradual return of ordinary noise to a landscape that had spent months muffled by snow and silence. Running water under open sky, birdsong at hours when it had been absent, the creak of cartwheels on paths that had been impassable. These sounds are mentioned, almost in passing, in later medieval accounts of rural Scandinavian life, as though the return of noise itself was worth remarking on. Silence had been the winter's dominant texture, and its slow replacement by sound was its own kind of evidence that the season had turned. The psychological shift is harder to document than the practical one. Yet scholars examining Norse and later Scandinavian folk tradition have suggested that the ending of a hard winter carried its own emotional residue. It was not simply happiness, there was often a tiredness underneath it, the particular fatigue of people who had spent months rationing food, tending fires, and watching the sky for danger. Surviving well did not mean surviving easily. What stands out most, looking back across the full arc of how these communities endured the cold, is how little of it depended on any single clever trick or extraordinary technology. The turf walls, the dried fish, the shared hearths, the careful autumn accounting of hay and debts and obligations. None of it was remarkable in isolation. Its strength lay in repetition, in the discipline of doing many small things correctly, season after season, for generations. That pattern, more than any individual detail, is perhaps the most lasting thing the Norse winter has to teach. Cold did not need to be defeated in some decisive way. It needed to be outlasted, together, through preparation carried out quietly, months in advance, by people who understood that survival was rarely dramatic. It simply required showing up for the work, again and again, until the ice finally let go. Looking back across an entire Norse winter, what stands out is not any single object or invention, but the sheer patience folded into daily life. A longhouse was never just a shelter. It was the sum of 1,000 quiet decisions made months earlier about turf thickness, hay stores, oiled tools, and mended nets. There was no dramatic contest between a Viking household and the cold. There was only steady attention, repeated, day after day, through darkness that pressed close for months at a time. Fires were tended. Animals were checked. Debts were settled before travel became impossible. And stories were told by firelight, not for entertainment alone, but to keep memory itself alive when nothing could be written down or verified until spring. What emerges from all of it is a picture of survival, built less on heroism than on rhythm. The same small acts, performed with care, season after season, generation after generation. A broken loom mattered. A dull axe mattered. A neighbor's borrowed ember mattered. None of these were remarkable on their own. Yet together they formed something durable enough to carry entire communities through the harshest months the northern world could offer. It's worth sitting with that thought for a moment. So much of what allowed people to endure the Scandinavian winter had nothing to do with dramatic acts of endurance, and everything to do with foresight, cooperation, and a willingness to keep doing ordinary things well, even when no one was watching and no reward was guaranteed. There is something quietly reassuring in that. The Norse winter was long, dark, and often dangerous. Yet it was met not with panic, but with preparation. With turf walls raised in autumn, with hay measured out by careful hands, with stories passed from one voice to another as the snow piled high against the door. Perhaps that is the real lesson, tucked inside these long winters of the past, that resilience rarely announces itself. It simply shows up, quietly, in the small things done again and again, until the light returns and the ice finally lets go. And that's where we leave it for tonight. Wherever you are, however heavy your eyes have gotten, there's nothing else you need to do right now. Just let it all go. Sleep well.